Hello, my name is Tommy McAfee, and welcome to this talk on RBAC security with the autonomous operator. So, feature overview here of some things that we've added to support fully managed RBAC. We've originally had our Couchbase cluster custom resource definition, CRD, and we've added a couple of more CRDs. So we added the Couchbase user, Couchbase role binding, and Couchbase group. So Couchbase role binding binds one or more users to a group, and the groups are associated with the roles. So that allows for things like partitioning roles and reusability, where you can have 100 users and they all can be reused inside of different groups. They all can be assigned roles from a single group, so you don't have to manage roles across individual users. So when creating a user, the first thing you want to do is actually create the Couchbase group custom resource. And the ordering isn't specific. There's no hard constraint on the ordering that you have to do this. You can create the users first or the role binding first, but it's generally best to just conceptually, when doing this, you create the group first. So here's an example of a Couchbase group custom resource. The important things here are to note the roles. So here we have a read-only admin role, so it's an administrator role, and then we have a bucket role, so it's giving a user full access to a bucket. And then for bucket roles, you can specify which bucket exactly the role should apply to. If you don't provide a bucket, then the role will apply to all the buckets in your cluster. And we've documented specifically which roles are administrative versus which roles are bucket roles, and which can be applied to the type of role that you're using. But, so having the Couchbase group custom resource, once you do a kubectl create on this spec, it's a one-to-one mapping between the custom resource and Couchbase RBAC group. So if you do create here, what you'll get is a group that now exists in Couchbase with the roles that you specified. And we haven't yet added any users to this group. We simply created the group and it's set up for being used for authentication. So the next steps you want to do is actually getting to adding users to the group. So we define some users here. One is a pretty simple resource. The important thing is that we're using the local auth domain for this particular example. So later on, we'll get into using LDAP for external authentication. But when you're using local, that simply means that you're allowing Couchbase to do the authentication of the user, and you're providing the auth secret, which is a way to include the password that should be used for the user that's logging in. So this particular example, we're going to add 3 users. Once you do kubectl on this resource, we still haven't yet added them to the Couchbase cluster because we haven't yet associated these users with the roles. So in order to do that, we create the Couchbase role binding resource. And this works very similar to roles or cluster roles that you've seen in Kubernetes, where we're referencing our Couchbase group and we're adding these 3 developer users to the group itself. So when you do a kubectl create on the role binding, that's when we actually get the users into Couchbase itself. And we see that they're all member of the same group, and therefore they all have the same exact roles associated with them. So one of the things that's nice about this is once you've added the users, you've had them involved with the group, then doing things like administrative things like adding a particular role or removing a role or just kind of managing the system becomes a lot easier. So in a particular example, if you wanted to add the replication admin role to all of the users, then you can simply add it to the group and then the users would inherit the new role. Also, so what's new in 2.0, we've added ways to specifically select which cluster users and groups can belong to. We do the same thing for buckets as well in XCCR with replications. So in this example, you can imagine having multiple clusters within the same namespace, and you want to filter which users that the cluster is able to see. And so, or select the specific resources that you want the cluster to be added to the cluster. And so first thing you want to do is edit the Couchbase cluster CR itself and add these matching labels. And then when you create your Couchbase user, add the labels which correspond to the cluster's matching labels, which means that these users will be selected only by this specific cluster that's been configured to match these labels. So that just allows you to avoid surprises from your user showing up in someone else's cluster and vice versa. So diving into some of the reconciliation scenarios here is what happens when you create and delete things. So this feature is fully managed. So we are actively trying to keep the real world in sync with what's happening in Kubernetes. By the real world, I'm just referring to Couchbase, specifically the RBAC element of management of Couchbase. So if you were to do a kubectl delete on a Couchbase group, then your users will also be removed from Couchbase server. We don't actively delete the Couchbase user resources from Kubernetes, but we remove them from server because once you delete the group, then we no longer know which roles correspond to the user. Same thing happens for the role bindings. If you delete a Couchbase role binding, then we also delete the users from Couchbase. The only exception to this would be if the users were bound to a different group with a different role binding elsewhere. Also, if you were to kubectl delete Couchbase user itself, then we also will remove the user directly from Couchbase. There is a bit of management to consider when you're doing this. Is you still might have your role binding referencing the user. And so when that happens, you'll see things in the logs, the bug logs, sort of warning you about a user that's been specified in a role binding, but has been deleted. So this is something to just keep in mind. It's not a sort of an error case per se. It's sort of an out of sync area that the operator itself doesn't attempt to actively manage, because you can essentially re-add the user, or you could be planning to add the user because there isn't really any ordering in the way that you're allowed to create users and role bindings and groups. So if you have this on debug level, then you'll see these logs. Otherwise, you may or may not be aware that this is happening. So getting onto different ways of authentication. So we allow LDAP for doing external authentication, and this takes advantage of Couchbase native LDAP authentication that was added to server 6.5 and higher. If you're using a lower version of server, then you can still use RBAC itself for adding users, but you will not be able to use the LDAP for external authentication. And so there's two main ways of doing authentication with external with LDAP itself. One way is to provide a template, which is a username which matches a query template. So you can imagine having a bunch of distinguished names that represent users in your LDAP server. So these are entries, but for the UID itself, you want a pattern match against users. So this particular UID, so we've had dev1 as our UID, then that would be the user that you would want to also log in as. And you can have dev1, dev3 all within the same example org. And then another way that's sort of better for scaling is to authenticate users that are members of an LDAP group. So you can do group query, and this will allow you to authenticate all users that are members of this particular LDAP group. So starting off with the first examples, the initial things that you want to do in order to support LDAP is to add these settings to the Couchbase cluster CRD. So we've added some basic things for just directing Couchbase to wherever your external LDAP host might be, and the type of encryption and things that you want to use for that. These are all settings that if you were to go through Couchbase through the UI, you would see sort of the same exact options there. We've just added them here in a way that you can manage them through the operator itself. Some of the important things to note is the bind distinguish name is going to be the username that Couchbase will use to, or the distinguished name that the Couchbase server will use in order to make queries against LDAP, and also the LDAP secret. So when Couchbase is trying to log in or authenticate with LDAP itself, it needs to be able to have a way to access that server and then to do things like query for entries within LDAP. Also for the template, so you want to also provide a template for if you want to do user authentication. And for the first type of example, where you have users that have a expected or determined format, and you want to sort of pattern match against users. So if I had in LDAP somewhere user J Brown and UID was sort of pattern matched in this way, then this would be the type of user that could authenticate with Couchbase by existing within LDAP itself. So let's say I have the user in LDAP, and now I actually want to authenticate through Couchbase with this user. So the first thing you want to do is kind of similar to before, where we want to create the Couchbase user. So it already exists in LDAP, but we want to create the matching Couchbase user. So we set the name equal to the ID name that we want to use. And then another important thing is to set the authentication domain as external. So this means that we want to allow authentication to occur from LDAP itself. We're not doing it within Couchbase. And then we want to bind the user to the group. So this is essentially the exact same as before. So we have all these users that are inheriting these roles, and then adding this additional Couchbase user allows this user to also inherit the roles from the Couchbase group. So simply updating the role binding, adding the user, we can now log in as our external user, provided we know what its password is within LDAP itself. But we've added external and internal users, and they all have the same roles. So you end up with a nice sort of hybrid approach if you were to want to go that route. So the one thing about this approach is you're adding a Couchbase user resource for every entry that exists in LDAP. So it's fine for maybe a couple development users, but if you really want to take advantage of having a large amount of users stored externally and just wanting to allow them to authenticate, then you will probably want to eventually move into doing things with the group query. So I'll get into how you can do that here. So the Couchbase RBAC group has added the LDAP group reference, a concept of an LDAP group reference, where the way it works is you can reference an LDAP group from a Couchbase group and provide a one-to-one mapping that essentially says any user that's a part of this LDAP group will be able to inherit the roles of the Couchbase group. So in order to add this group reference, we edit our Couchbase group and we add this specific distinguished name of the group that we want to allow to have the same roles as our Couchbase group. So this is simply for authorization. It simply means that users are allowed to inherit these same roles, but it doesn't necessarily say anything about authentication. For that, we need to add the group query to the Couchbase cluster security settings. So this sort of extends our initial settings that we had before. So we're adding the group query. It happens to be the exact same as the groups that we're authorizing, which is almost always going to be the case. I suppose you can have an authentication in the authorization group, but either way it goes, the members that are logging in will be a part of both of them anyway. The other thing that we're setting is the authorization enabled to true, which means that not only can they authenticate, but we're granting the same users the ability to inherit roles from the groups once they authenticate. So an example of how this sort of looks and how it all works together is you can have, 10, 100,000 entries within LDAP of users and specify a single group. And within that group, describe all of the members of that group. So for this example, every user with UID developer security admin will be able to authenticate. And since we've specified this group within our LDAP group reference, they'll also be able to inherit these same roles. So this kind of works as like a role binding of LDAP users to Couchbase roles, because you don't necessarily need to add all of these users to the Couchbase role binding itself. You can log in as these users simply by making them a part of a group and associating the group with the Couchbase group. So I want to, so that's authentication, both internally, externally, along with authorization. Just want to give a quick demo of what that looks like and how you can simply get started and manage RBAC with the operator. So I have a 3-node cluster here. I go to security. I don't have any groups, anything created yet. So the first thing I mentioned, it's usually best to create your groups. So I have a group here with the read-only admin and the bucket full access bucket role. So I'm going to create the group first. And we see the group appears with the application access to default bucket. And we still don't have users yet because we've just kind of created our group. So the next thing we want to do is we can take a look at our users that we want to create. So I have 3 users, 3 dev users, and they're all using the local auth domain. So I'm going to go ahead and create these users. So we have our users created. Again, the users are here. But they haven't been added to Couchbase, and the reason why is because we haven't applied role bindings to them yet. So we don't really know what roles apply to these users to add them. So let's check out our role binding. So as we expect in the examples before, I have 3 users and they are going to be bound to this dev group that we've already created. So create the role binding, the users are bound to the role, and what we will see is the users are added to the group and they all have inherited the same exact roles from the group itself. So then it makes it really easy to do things like manage and update and change things about the users and the roles that they have. So let's say we want to change some things about our group. Specifically, right now, the bucket full access is limited to default bucket, but let's say we want to give them access to all the buckets. And let's say we're doing some XCCR work. So we want to make everyone replication admin. So we're going to make that change. So instead of having to click through everything and edit each one, The operator goes and it syncs up your group, changes the group. The users automatically inherit the roles from the group, and we have these changes applied universally there. As far as how management works, so this is a fully managed feature. So when you're reconciling, if you do things like try to go and delete a user, because the user still exists in Kubernetes, then the operator detects that there's something out of sync, specifically that this user should exist, but it's not here, so it recreates it. If you, to delete things, you would have to actually go and delete the Couchbase user itself, and that would delete it. And then, of course, we talked about if you delete the group, then we will lose our users because we no longer have a group that the users belong to. And we can always recreate that and it'll all come back. So yeah, that's pretty much it from just a getting started perspective. And I'm just gonna have to edit that. Just my slides. Okay, so I'm gonna do that transition again. So that's pretty much it from a getting started perspective. I appreciate you guys for hanging around and checking it out. There's a lot of additional resources here. So for tutorials for doing things with LDAP, we've created an end-to-end tutorial for creating a LDAP server, open LDAP server, and actually doing some test authentication with it, learning more about RBAC concepts. So doing things, what does it actually mean to add a user, to delete a user, the reconciliation part of it, and then the references to users, the roles and role bindings. This gets more specifically into what are the roles that you can add, what are the specs for the off domain for the users, and the role bindings, what type of roles what type of bindings can you create. So yeah, so that's pretty much there for more information, and appreciate you guys for joining the talk.